All right, good morning again, everyone, and welcome back to the old fire station. This event this morning is a very special one. We are launching a new book, and we're launching a new book by someone who is a regular festival participant, attendee, a kind of icon of literary scholarship. That is, of course, Professor Gordon Rohlehr, who passed away last year. And I think you all know by now that he completed this book and submitted it to his publisher before he died. And we are, even though he's no longer with us, the book is with us. And I also understand it's not even his last book. There may be still one more to come. But this, Jeremy Poynting is nodding in the front row. But this book is I've read it, so I'm not just making this up. It's an important book for many reasons. It's an important book because of what it tells us about Professor Rohlehr. It's important because of what it tells us about Kamau Brathwaite, the Barbadian poet, who Gordon Rohlehr had a very, well, as you'll hear, a very fascinating and multi-decade relationship with. It was a personal and a professional and a literary relationship. And the book charts that, and it draws on Gordon Rohlehr's private papers, his notebooks, his correspondence. It tells us a lot about just, as a historical document about a key period in Caribbean literary history. It tells us about the personalities of writers and scholars. It tells us about, what it's like juggling with, ideas of recognition and obscurity and what we pay attention to in our society and what we don't. It covers all of those things. So we're very happy that we have Jeremy Poynting from People Tree Press, publisher of A Literary Friendship, here with us. And in a moment, he's going to give you his insights as publisher about the book. And following that, we're going to have a conversation led by Barbara Lalla, Professor Barbara Lalla, who is a colleague of Gordon Rohlehr at the University of the West Indies, joined also by Professor Paula Morgan, another colleague of Professor Rohlehr at the university, as well as Anu Lakhan, writer, former student and friend of Gordon Rohlehr, and Aaron Kamugisha, also himself a professor, literary scholar. But before we get into any of that, I'm very, very, very happy that we have with us this morning Dr. Betty Ann Rohlehr, who is going to come up and give you a personal greeting of her own. We thank her for allowing us to launch this book this morning and for being here with us. And so I want you to give her a big round of applause as she comes up to say hello to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. It is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to this session, especially since I was the one who was with him when he went to send the contract to Jeremy to DHL, and the kind of struggles we had with DHL that particular morning. And by contract, if you know Gordon is the kind of person who very patient. And he sat there waiting for almost an hour while I was getting very agitated that I had to wait a whole hour before they dealt with a letter. So, you're not hearing? Sometimes I think I speak loudly, but I don't, obviously. Any better? Yes. Right. So I was saying that I was at DHL. So after about an hour, he is waiting patiently, and I went up the steps to DHL asking them, what is happening? Why do we have to wait a whole hour? And they said, well, they had a lot of goods that time, and this is the reason why they slowed down. So I went back again to my seat, but of course I'm itchy. And Gordon, in typical Gordon, and this is why I'm saying it, because this is the character of the guy. He sat there quietly, not making any fuss. he's not walking up the steps. So I decided, I whispered to him, I think we should go. We will find FedEx somewhere, because we were used to FedEx, it was near to us. And that's what we did. So on our way, we discovered FedEx was not too far away. And FedEx was really the courier we used. So I said to him, well, okay, maybe we can stop now. The other part of Gordon is he's hungry. So he said, no, we're going home. So we went home, and the first thing he went to do, of course, is to eat. And he's cool. He will wait until next day when he gets the FedEx. So that is one characteristic of Gordon that you should know. Very patient. Gordon has had, I would say, I could identify a number of loves. And one of them is writing and reading. As my helper said one day, she said she heard about bookworms, but she didn't understand it until she worked with us and met Gordon. Because he's always with a book and notes, a yellow pad, legal size, and always scribbling. Wherever he is, scribbling. If he goes with me to the doctor, he's there reading, writing, scribbling. So writing and reading was Gordon's first love. But I don't know how many persons know how much his other love was music. He loved music. And if you go to his library now, you'd see half of the library would be all kinds of sizes. You know, they used to have the LPs, and then you go down to tapes. And Gordon's library, half of it, music. And when I tell you he loved music, I can go through all the music of North America, come down to South America. You could come across to the Caribbean, from the calypso right up to the reggae, go across to Europe, classics, come down to Africa, African music, all kinds of music. And when I got married to Gordon, I had to learn how to shut off my ear, because whenever we got in the car, it was music. Anytime it was music. And sometimes the classics, you know, some of the classics, everything going, sounding good, and then you hear, brang. And he's quite comfortable, and I really had to, no. So music was his second love. And the third love, before I move away from that, when he was in Jamaica, he sang in the choir. And Jennifer, his friend, told me that he sang so loudly sometimes that he would drown them out. But if you know, he had a lovely bass voice. And every morning, when he goes to organize his breakfast, notice I said when he organizes his breakfast, he would be singing. And my mother used to love that, because compared to her daughter, who would get up really little grouchy, he was getting up ready and bouncy and ready and singing away. So he was always singing. So he sang in the choir, and then when he left and he went to Birmingham, Gordon started a steel band. He and a side of Trinidadians started a steel band. And he was chief tuner of the band. So much so that when he is tuning pan, he doesn't even know about tuning pan, that you have to have earmuffs. So he is tuning pan, and apparently as the note got higher, it affected his ear, pop, one ear went. And he came to Trinidad. I married him with one ear. And many persons didn't know that he could only hear in one ear. So when he's talking to you, he will turn the ear right? And our daughter Donna used to say he could hear sometimes, because he would hear what we don't want him to hear. So they played pan, and apparently, for whatever, in the 60s, you could imagine what that pan probably sounded like. But at that time, people still invited them to come and play the steel band. And the last love of his is cricket. Anywhere in the world, anybody is playing cricket, Gordon will be there in spirit, on television, on the computer, following up, whether it is the West Indies playing or England playing, Australia or India or whatever it is. That was his last love, cricket. And I'm sure there are other things, food, but that I wouldn't dwell on that too much, right? So ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you all very much for coming. It is very rewarding to see so many persons here, and I sincerely hope that you will enjoy this session. But I still have to say something about those people on the stage. Barbara is Gordon's colleague, has been Gordon's colleague for a number of years. Aaron is again one of Gordon's colleagues. He met Gordon, I don't know when they met, but I know that Gordon invited him to give a lecture once to his group in Barbados, when he was in Barbados. And they always correspond in some form or whatever. Anu, Gordon loves Anu. Yeah. Anu was one of his students, and he just loves Anu. And Paula was one of his students and transitioned to one of his colleagues and friend and so on. So they all have some relationship with Gordon, right? And Gordon is a big lover of people, just love people. You would never hear him saying anything about anybody that you can bad, so he's good at that. So I'm very happy that we have 4 of these persons who are familiar with Gordon and will share with us, right? Lastly, let me talk about Jeremy. I told Jeremy, I am not into literature. That was Gordon's field. My own is different. My own is in education, right? I used to be a geography teacher and then went straight into education and worked at the university in the learning resource, helping with the lecturers, with teaching and so on. That was my thing. I told Jeremy up front. So if you think that because I named Dr. Betty Ann Rohlehr and Gordon Rohlehr, that you can call me to edit or anything with Gordon Rohlehr. So I made it quite clear, right? So Jeremy was really fantastic. He just called me to ask me, do you think I should do so-and-so? One, two things that I think I could handle. And he went ahead. So he became the editor and the publisher. So please put your hands together for Jeremy. Because without Jeremy, we would not have been able to complete the book and be here today. So once again, we enjoy it. I'll see you sometime. I'll chat with you all after. Okay? Bye.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Betty Ann Rohlehr, and please let's give her another round of applause to thank her for being here, for sharing those recollections with us, for giving us some jokes, and also making my life easier because now I don't need to introduce Jeremy, right? So everyone, Jeremy Poynting of People Tree Press.
Good morning, everybody. Just first of all, to thank Dr. Betty Ann Rohlehr for beginning the day for us so splendidly. And she just made me feel really sad that I never knew Gordon better. That, I mean, he could have been a good friend. So that, I know these people are going to say more about their relationship to him. Mine was very kind of occasional, though he did once, Gordon's had an astonishing kind of attitude to archive. I remember one time he produced this letter I'd written to him about 40 years ago, which he still had in his folder. So that was the man. So we only really met at Bocas, which is another good thing that Bocas did. And as Nicholas says, I mean, he told me that this was his, when he did Perfected Fables Now, this was his last book. He said, "Have fun, man, gone no more." But this is the second book since then, and as Nicholas said, there's another one to follow. So I think, perhaps blow a little trumpet that, that it encouraged him not to stop. And as you'll see, this is a very, very important book that he had. I've known about Gordon's work for a long time. I used to read it in things like Tapir and so on, and knew what an important critic he was. And I think it was part of the kind of rigor of Gordon's kind of political ethics that he published here. So I see Ken Jaika Singh is in the audience, and Ken published him here. But of course, one of the consequences was that the books didn't always reach outside Trinidad. So that I think Gordon was never perhaps recognized at the level he should have been as a very important Caribbean intellectual, public intellectual. And, so that one of the goals that we've had is about trying to restore his thing. So, bringing back into print his important criticism of the 80s and 90s and so on. Because I always thought things like in essays like The Shape of That Hurt, what he was doing was so important. And not only was he kind of looking at the radical writing that was emerging out of that period, but he was describing very exactly the shape of its aesthetics. And there was nobody else doing it quite in the way that Gordon was doing. So that, I suspect some of the people are here, but when there's an otherwise very excellent Routledge Companion to Caribbean Literature, and it did not deal with Gordon. And that disappointed me. So that, again, part of the kind of goal of that was to repair that breach, to put it in. I'm going to only talk very briefly about a literary friendship and to just talk about three of what I think are its very important themes. The first one is thinking about the way in which writers particularly, no doubt people in general, at later points in their lives begin thinking and sometimes writing about their legacies and trying to shape their legacies. And of course, this is what that book does. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about Gordon's concerns with amnesia, the loss of continuity, and his call for respect for ancestors, literary ones in this case. And the third point I want to, again, sort of perhaps the panel will take up some of these, is to think about the way that Gordon asks us to think about how we look both backwards and forwards, how we look at the past and how we make use of the past, as well as looking into the future. And I'm thinking about how when Gordon was writing those important critical essays in the 80s and 70s and 80s and 90s, he was often writing about young Trinidadian poets who nobody else had heard of. And that was kind of academic kind of courage to do that. He didn't wait until people had established a reputation. He saw what was new and he wrote very well about it. So to deal with the first one of the things that Gordon writes about in the book is that he gives a lot of credit, for instance, to Rhonda Cobham's excellent book, I, Epitaphs for the Self, in the work of V.S. Naipaul, Kamau Brathwaite, and Derek Walcott, which is a really important critical book, one that Kamau didn't like at all, we used to say. And it deals with the fact about how writers continually reconstruct their identities and how often late in their lives they write epitaphs to themselves in the way they wish people to read them and to think about them in the future. And of course, the classic of that, writers have always done that. They're thinking about Thomas Hardy, who had his second wife, Florence Dugdale, apparently write his biography. And of course, Hardy had written it almost all himself. And that was about reshaping his future. So when Gordon writes his memoir of his relationship with Kamau, he's writing it within that consciousness of this is what he is doing. He is leaving us a kind of a record of, in a sense, of how he wants to be regarded. And I think because he writes within that kind of awareness of what he's doing, he writes with a radical kind of honesty. And it's an honesty which also covers the fact that sometimes his good friend Kamau didn't always write with that kind of honesty. And I think that's an important part of the kind of integrity of the book. The second point I want to make is that within that kind of consciousness of reaching that stage in his life where he wanted to take stock, that he does it without any kind of special pleading, but he does it within a consciousness which we have to get to grips with, that he's part of a generation who was very rapidly leaving the stage. A generation, in his words, that had walked the route from colonialism to neo-colonialism. And he was very honest about that fact. So he writes at one point, it was a whole generation that was dying out, hard, blank, inevitable, inescapable stone, and the relentless closure of an era. And I mean, glancing, so that we know, we Eddie Bohr mentioned it yesterday, Roger McTair in Canada, who's just died, Rupal Mona, who is a good friend of mine in Guyana, died just a month ago, Michael Anthony, Kamau, Wilson Harris, V.S. Naipaul, Derek Walcott, Austin Clarke, Michael Gilkes, Garth Santoma, Alan Bully, and those who left. I put the earlier bit in because I noticed there were no women there in that list of things, and this is an important point. So people like Louise Bennett, Sam Selvin, Martin Carter, Anthony McNeil, and those who left too early, like my good friend Jennifer Rahim. So you'll no doubt have others to add to that kind of list. But it makes the point that a generation has almost gone. And so it leaves us with, with the task of thinking about that fact. So this is part of Gordon's consciousness. And he's aware, for instance, that at one point he's beginning to field queries from younger scholars. People want to know about this. Some of them want to know about the past. So he writes at one point, suddenly the past, which had tracked me down and sniffed me out of my bubble and meander of solitude, had become valuable to a new and dislocated generation in quest of continuity, links in a chain back to ancestors. Suddenly, like Kamau or George or Sam, I had become history. But you have to say that was Gordon's optimistic thought. And Gordon always in the book, you will see, confesses himself to be a born pessimist. I'm not sure about the born bit, but I think perhaps it's more truly that he was a never self-deceiving realist, so that that he never pretends that things are other than they were. But what he really fears is that the products of the life of writing and thought will be submerged in the noise of, and I think he quotes Derek Walcott, politics, rain, unrest. And he has to wonder, of what relevance really is the intellect or sensitivity when confronted with the neutering effect of amnesia? And he draws a picture of his own society, and it's so true, and it's true of most societies, that it can barely remember the past 20 years. That once those 20 years, the rest has gone. So this is what I think really in the end connects him to Kamau Brathwaite and the cost of that particular mission. He quotes Kamau about his mission being to connect broken islands, cracked words, worlds, friendship, ancestries. And of course, what Gordon points out when he talks about, and it's very much the theme of Bocas, that writers need readers, and he wonders, for instance, who's read some of his most recent books. And that's an important point thing. So he recognizes that that people have to be listening and engaging to those who've got important messages about not forgetting the ancestors. And then he says, in the meantime, one has to archive. Because even if people are not listening, at some point, somebody will wake up and think, all this stuff was important. And I think we see how important archives are when we think about what's happening in Gaza now, where it's not only Gaza's present that is being wiped off the map, but Gaza's past. The mosques, the medieval mosques that have been blown down. The fact there is a very deliberate and conscious Israeli destruction of Palestinian history in the place. And that's when people talk about ethnic cleansing. So it's not just the educators, the poets and the intellectuals and the innocent, it's also the history of the place which is going, the importance of archives. So I think one of the challenges of Gordon's book is to make us think hard about how we should relate to and keep alive and build on and critique its silences. So obviously one of the list of names I read out, the toll of that generation, is such a male generation. And of course, since then, there are important new kind of women's writing, of LGBTI writing, some of which, particularly that Gordon in his later books begins to take notice of. So it raises the question about the proper ways in which we think about the past. I mean, I'm coming from a UK which is full of a kind of reactionary nostalgia about empire and so on. The Brexit, the barely disguised white supremacist dreams of a Britain which is world-beating and so on. Even when black and brown members of the present government are the ones who are espousing that kind of talk. So there is a very unhealthy kind of nostalgia of looking back, which ignores the real costs and the ways in which, for instance, empire and colonialism, the rewards are still in the possessions of British elites. And elites here too. So I think there's also the other kind of side of it, which is the kind of neoliberal ideology of constant modernity, the global reach of capital creating ever greater inequalities, with its slogan, "There is no other way." And it's what's been happening to all the social democratic parties who keep on telling us, forget all the old stuff, forget socialist dreams, it's all old hat. Embrace the market and welcome the private profit motive into public utilities. And look what's happened in the UK, shit in our rivers and so on. So I think too that what Gordon's book does is to make us rethink the way that we should be looking at the past. It's the kind of, and it's about him embracing both what is new. So he's the person who writes Pathfinder about Kamau Brathwaite's book when nobody else was really grasping what was really new about that book. But he also has a deep appreciation for what somebody like George Lamming was writing about in the idea of the ceremony of the souls in a season of adventure. So I think there is something that, I don't know that Gordon would ever use the word, but I think he would agree with it, that there is something you can call a radical recuperation of the past. And I'm pleased to see that, for instance, people like Aaron on the stage there is doing that in things like Beyond Coloniality, in writing about C.L.R. James and Sylvia Wynter and rethinking them and so on. I think it's there in things like David Scott's and Shirley Napuri's books about Grenada, where the temptation is not to look at that recent past and to think it's a dead and buried stuff, and trying to find omens from it that are still working on to. So I think that's one of the kinds of things we can draw from Gordon's book, that it makes us both embrace what is new and genuinely dynamic, but also not to lose touch with the ancestors that everybody needs to have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. And now I'm going to hand over to Barbara Lalla, Professor Emerita Barbara Lalla of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. One of my teachers, as was Gordon Rohlehr in my first semester, my first year as an undergraduate at UWI. Barbara, of course, is also a literary writer, a novelist, and I just want to flag that her most recent book, her most recent novel, By Such a Parting Light, has just been published, and we will in fact be hearing from that book this afternoon at another event. But for now, I'm going to hand over to her to run this conversation among our panelists, who Betty Ann has already given her own introduction to. So let's get the conversation started. Let's give them some applause, and let's hear some more about the book.
Great. Thank you all for being here and for having me. It is a privilege. And let's get right into the discussion. I think that everybody has been introducing everybody, and perhaps we should, and it's in the Bocas booklet, so perhaps we should move straight into the discussion. And I'm going to ask Aaron if he might start us off with his comments.
All right, so good morning, everyone, and let me start by conveying my thanks to Bocas for another invitation to be on their platform. The last time I was here in 2017, and I asked Nicholas how to prepare for one of these conversations, he said, do not actually write anything, okay? Or anything of any significance, because that's going to break the flow of the conversation. Of course, I'm seeing that my co-panelists have a whole manuscript there, among other things. So, but I try to keep my word. This is all I have, points, but I'm going to try to go through them. I'm going to start with some reflections on meeting and some encounters I had with Rohlehr before I go into making some points about the book, and then hopefully having the time to end with a quote from his past work that I find particularly relevant. I first met Gordon in 1998 when he delivered a lecture on Kamau and Lambing, the Winston Scott Memorial Lecture, the big establishment lecture of the Central Bank of Barbados, one which I am more likely to be inducted in the American Academy of Letters than being invited to do. And I heard that lecture was broadcast on TV, and I was entranced by it. But I didn't actually meet him in person until 2001, my first visit to Trinidad. It was either the Henry Sylvester Williams 100th Anniversary Conference or the magnificent C.L.R. James Centenary Conference later on that year. Moving on, a couple of years later, I'm in Toronto doing my PhD. I meet him when he comes and gives this wonderful lecture. At that time, I think he was focusing on his work, which became the Intersecting QRC Lies essay. And he was talking very much about his time at Queen's College, about his friendship with Walter Rodney, who was his classmate. And I will never forget how he ended that lecture all of these years later when he spoke about Rodney and Rodney's political convictions. And then he said, that is how he lived, and that is how he died, and that is where I'll end. Okay? And that was the end of the lecture. And by that time, in the process of doing graduate work and ransacking the Caribbean intellectual tradition for theories, perspectives that I thought can move us beyond the bewildering coloniality of the current states that we inhabited, I started to understand, okay, closer, yes, all right. I started to understand that Gordon Rohlehr was without a doubt the greatest literary cultural critic that the Anglophone Caribbean has produced in the post-independence era. Okay? And I think that's not as fully realized in the same way that we have such a great, deep, abiding respect for the work, the life work of Walter Rodney, his classmate. But when you look at the arc of the work and the importance of the work, there is no doubt. And so I was very happy, again, to be able to invite Rohlehr for the first time, my first invitation to him in 2016, to be the keynote speaker and to do the launch of my book, Caribbean Popular Culture in Barbados. But moving beyond, fast forwarding, January 2020. So 31st of January 2020, I'm in transit in Detroit, from a lecture in Atlanta. And I'm back and forth with Nicholas because Nicholas is urging me to get in contact with Beverly Brathwaite to see if Kamau will actually accept the Lifetime Bocas Achievement Award. I've been trying for a couple of days. I tried one more time. I got her. I'm speaking to her long distance, roaming from the Detroit airport. She says, yes, Kamau will accept the award. I say, wonderful. 4 days later, Kamau Brathwaite passes away. And I was at this time teaching a course in honor of Kamau at University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, titled Kamau at 90. Due to the great interest by students, I had 3 registrations, which would later become 2 after 1 week. And then when COVID broke, it became 1 person in the class after 1 went back to London. It was a great 1-person class, so she was very good. She started by saying she doesn't know anything about poetry, and within a few weeks she was talking about intertextuality and all that kind of stuff. But I was there also for Kamau Brathwaite's funeral, and when I heard Gordon's eulogy at the funeral, I was entranced by it, and I'm going to actually the last line from the eulogy, which if you don't know, I'm sure you'll want to hear. It went as follows. Kamau, my brother, my longtime friend, traveling soul and soldier of consciousness, may your journey now be straight going. May your road be a peaceful one. The last line, of course, from the Arrivants. So after the funeral, in discussions with colleagues on Small Acts Board, we knew we had to do a homage to Kamau Brathwaite. I was editing the homage on Kamau Brathwaite, and I said to Gordon, okay, well, you know, I really need something for you from this. You're the most outstanding Kamau Brathwaite, a scholar in the world. I need something from you. Can we republish that eulogy? That eulogy was so wonderful. Can we republish it? He said, well, you know, you're a week too late because Opal Palmer-Adisa has asked me to publish it in the Caribbean Writer. I was there, damn. Okay, so can you then instead give me 4,000 words on Kamau Brathwaite? Okay, so he said yes. So we waited the months, everybody had handed in theirs, and I kept going back to Gordon over and over, trying to get this. He finally sent it to me. 52,000 words. 210 after he'd been working on, he said he was going to do something new, he'd do something new. 210-page manuscript of his friendship with Kamau Brathwaite, from meeting him in 1966 at the Caribbean Artists Movement to coming and doing the official eulogy at the state funeral for Kamau Brathwaite in 2020. One of the most romantic things I've ever read in my life, okay? Yeah. And the question was what to do with it, but I figured out, you know, David Scott told me he does not know how I would be able to. I said, no. I got the 9,000 words, and we figured out the 9,000 words that we were going to publish from it. I must say that, of course, manuscript is a manuscript that is now being published as a literary friendship. And we'll talk more in the discussion about the book, but I'll just say one of the most powerful and overarching themes to me throughout it has simply been the power of the survival of friendship amidst the deep disappointments, disagreements, and disillusionments that friends have. Because it is by no means a praise song for Kamau Brathwaite, okay? That is not what the book is. There are resentments. There is Gordon's own sense that Kamau never fully appreciated his own work and would write about it in letters, but would never actually write on him in the same way that Gordon was constantly writing on Kamau. So there are all of those things there amidst a deep, abiding respect and appreciation. The part towards the end when Gordon visits both George Lamming and Kamau Brathwaite, his last visit to them in Barbados is an incredible moment. You know, when he describes both of them, how he describes how Lamming was there, he's in the nursing home, but he's there, he's content, he's managed to do his life work and what he's meant to do. Kamau, though, was still struggling with his sense of his legacy, still struggling with his pain and resentment over what had happened to him at Mona, what had happened to him at New York and Barbados, how he felt about his legacy and his life. All of that is there in the book, which makes it a really remarkable book. But I'm not sure where I am on time, but I think it's probably time to conclude, or come soon to. And I want to actually conclude with one of Gordon's essays. Perhaps if I was to choose a single one, my favorite one by him, Articulating a Caribbean Aesthetic, The Revolution of Perception, which starts off his collection, My Strangled City. Of course, My Strangled City is a line from the great Martin Carter. Here beneath my feet, my strangled city lies, my father's city and my mother's heart. But I'm going to give you the last paragraph from this essay. It's 1979, speech verse, and then published essay by Gordon Rohlehr. And so it comes just before that incredible outpouring of literary talent that is going to transform the whole nature of Caribbean literature in the 1980s, which we now know as Caribbean women's writing. So this is Rohlehr. Fierceness and bleakness of vision are characteristic of the 1970s. Our poets at home have become furiously driven men. Walcott, Carter, Brathwaite, McNeill, Scott, Roach, or Questel all share this driven quality, which is a direct response to the quality of chaos that exists in the contemporary Caribbean. One has traveled a considerable distance from the simple vision of the 1930s and 40s. The revolution of self-perception has always been taking place, and it continues, grows increasingly more complex and multifaceted. It embraces now both the notion of ethnic heritages and their competition and confrontation in the contemporary post-independence Caribbean. It involves the relentless class struggle and the survival of structures and instruments of exploitation and repression. It hovers between the alternatives of Adamic renewal or return and existential sense of void. It challenges conventional notions of history and is part of a vast worldwide movement to relocate the submerged cultures of the devastated in the kingdom of human and humane achievement. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you so much, Aaron. Now we're going to go straight to Anu, and then through Paula, and then we'll talk further. Thanks.
Hi, Bessie. Okay, so I too will start with hopefully very brief reflections. It was love at first lecture for me. Checklist. Legal notepad, lined yellow, check. Tape recorder, check. I also had a tiny tape recorder, not the grand one he walked with. So far we have two things in common. And this is the first lecture as an undergraduate student. I wasn't a nerd, obviously. Legal notepad, tape recorder. I have had a life almost embarrassingly full of love, but what I needed was someone who really understood how I thought and what I wanted to do with these thoughts. At the ancient age of 19, I'd already abandoned one sort of degree in favor of another. In one of my earliest classes in St. Augustine, Dr. Royden Salick, who I do not think I see here, said that we'd remember the names of writers, but it was the critics who would put us on the map. I met Gordon, and I knew that Dr. Salick was right. My checklist has another point on it. I like to think in some modest way, I got Gordon. Maybe not as much as he got me, but I so much want to believe that I did, just in some small way. And it was the arguments that did it. Not fights, just good, wholesome debate. And those debates were increasingly about the nuanced points on the evolution of soca and its pantheon. And there was a language of starting at point A and moving smartly along to point G with no need for any explanation in between. I had found my safe place to land. Pretend, I know it's hard, but pretend you can visualize me at 19 or 20, and it's the mid-90s. Do you see this girl as the person you're going to come to with your calypso questions? If you cannot grasp what it meant for me, Hindu, Indian, St. Jamesian, and the family pet on top of everything else, if you can't understand what it might mean for me to have been truly seen by him, then I cannot in any way explain anything. But because he was who he was, he saw me and what I could be, and he never wavered, and he never thought anything was beyond me. I think of the bass and the double bass as somehow a very fitting instrument for Gordon. I don't play it, but I have some words from a vaguely known bass player. And this bass player is also a musician, a singer, so I have some lyrics from him. Under the dog star sail, under the reefs of moonshine, under the skies of fall, north, northwest, the stones of Faro, under the Arctic fire, over the seas of silence, hauling on frozen ropes, for all my days remaining, but would north be true? So I have a thing for Gordon's, and this is Gordon Sumner, who is a Sting, and his song, Why Should I Cry For You? So Gordon was my North Star. He is my North Star. And away from reflections now, I call my non-reflection part Hurt Without Shape, for Gordon without music. Let's begin at the end, shall we? Taken from notebook number 19 of Gordon, Words Need Love 2, 2016. I have, for over 5 decades and counting, written at length on the work of our poets, calypsonians, novelists, and even historians, imposing on my meager public the burden of reading long, arduous things, of rolling boulder after boulder of hard words, trying to lift these, my fellow verbalists, out of their solitude by giving to their words the love they desperately need. I have tried to clarify hard, knotted obscurities, to work through rather than around entanglements of word and metaphor. These are Gordon's words, but this is also Gordon as we know him in every way, the writer, critic, academic, teacher, and friend. This book, A Literary Friendship, is not a book for those afraid of the end, for those afraid of failure, erasure, shunting, shunning, or frailty. Not for those afraid of being a little afraid of what they might see of themselves in and around the words and episodes. Here's what you already know. This is a story of 2 of the more extraordinary minds we will see in our lifetimes, and not only in or of the Caribbean, just in our lifetimes. Everything we do need not be prefaced by in the Caribbean, or in the West Indies, or in Trinidad and Tobago, as though this caveat is essential for some containment or cordoning off of what we produce. To locate ourselves is one matter, to restrict quite another. But as I was saying, here are two minds, both curious and curiouser, both creative, both searching, articulate, and ceaselessly gathering whole libraries of knowledge they wanted to share, both knowing that words need love. How much were they allowed to do that? How many classrooms, conferences, or publications would have ever been enough? One had more opportunities and recognition than the other. As both this text, as well as others, and as readers of both men are aware, it was no mean part of Gordon's life's work to promote and demystify Brathwaite's writing and to secure his place in the canon. Kamau wrote, and he wrote, and then he wrote some more. In what he writes to Gordon, there is a never-endingness in his sense of solitude, isolation, and despair. The feeling that he is ignored, misunderstood, and undefended. Since what we have here are his letters and Gordon's commentary, it is a marvel that there is space to think of these concepts as applying to a wider audience, because Kamau does not leave room for any thoughts beyond his own person. There is great humility and nobility in both the work and persona of Gordon Rohlehr. There must be, inherently, intravenously, involuntarily even, to allow him to do the work he did and kept doing, and not just for Brathwaite and other vaunted writers. He did it for an ocean of students, fresh waves every year, from St. Augustine to darkest Nagadoches, that one-horse town, where he once tried to teach a course in Calypso. 4 students signed in. They deregistered on the first day. I'm lifting this little bit from its context, but its relevance is not lost. He writes, "It was like me asking my own students in St. Augustine, who was Uriah Butler? No one knew except one girl, an exchange student who had been prepped and who subsequently died, probably under the weight of such strange and unusual knowledge." How did Gordon survive us? He was the bookman, but one of grace and generosity. A bookman from whom we did not fear eternal damnation, but from whom we knew we could always learn and lean on. In one exchange, Brathwaite goes to the Rohlehr Memory Bank for items like, and I list, the connection between Derek Walcott and V.S. Naipaul, a production by the Trinidad Theatre Workshop, the connection between Eric Williams and C.L.R. James, Pat Bishop's thesis, Ken Ramchand's date of birth and the title of his thesis, Gordon's own articles and books of Kaiso. Brathwaite is not alone here. I think many of us thought Gordon would always have the information we needed, even Ken's date of birth. Gordon is known so much for what he taught us, but there is not nearly enough discussion on the quality of his own writing, because he was a fine writer. This is one of the most damning oversights on the part of those who seek to address his work, because as with all writing of quality, it is often in the phrasing and the parsing itself that we come to some of his most important insights. Because you, the reader, are so caught up in the one idea you think you're following, you miss myriad connections, allusions, and nods in the general direction of God knows what else. Here's the thing that haunts me. It's in the text. He's talking about Don Drummond, rhapsodizing really, and he says this amazing thing. The trombone could howl in the middle of some sentimental curve of song, Drummond had a habit of leaning just that little bit longer, just that little bit more heavily on a note. And in doing so, he defined what that moment meant, giving it meaning, point. That's not a fine piece of writing about music. It's just a fine piece of writing, period. I also see so much of Gordon in it. Perhaps that is the ghost in this sentence, because that is how he wrote and how he spoke. By knowing where to lay stress and emphasis on theme or character, or indeed writer, he gave meaning and point. Think of the great sprawling mural that is the body of work he left. It is a grand thing to stand back and take in. But then to start looking at it sentence by sentence, one idea linked to another, one square inch of Rohlehrian thinking at a time. And there you will find the thing that has been his trademark from his earliest work to the present, the ability to find connections across centuries and continents of text. Not to ignore history, but to draw it closer by revealing patterns, to show the seamlessness of lives, and to do all this not in an alienating academic way, but in an accessible way, inviting style. He wanted to bring us all in to what he was saying. During an especially difficult time in his life, he says pessimism had always nestled at the center of his void. And I cannot doubt that. Not that the enthusiasm, wit, humor, and insight that we saw as his everyday dress was a mask or a mask, but you simply cannot ignore the death by 1,000 slights. Love is a killing thing. And Gordon loved us, and he loved what he did. He made brave choices about, among other things, where to be, what to teach, and how to publish. These words are not in the text, but we do not read only for words, but also for spaces. Being here meant that the world of opportunities available to those who went foreign were not his for the asking. His passion for calypso, soca, and all their friends and family didn't seem to resonate with the students 100 years ago when I was on campus. The beautiful, important scholarship on these subjects. Who's studying it? Who is engaging with it apart from the odd, demented writer who forces it weekly upon innocent readers? There is work being done on our music, but it's liming outside the region, somewhere in the VAC academisphere. We complain about this, but then we keep ignoring it. The idea that your ideas will be forgotten are piling up around you. Of musings, mazes, muses, margins. He says, Betty is against my publishing what she reads as a mad production of a man with multiple personality disorder whose other books are not selling and take up too much space in the house. Just like at the conference to mark his retirement, at which everyone who spoke about Gordon thanked Betty, even now we are indebted to her. Hers is the unmentioned but devoted friendship that runs through this book. This literary friendship is a fine thing, a fine idea, but if it doesn't cut both ways, it only cuts. When Gordon invites Kamau to his retirement affair, Kamau says yes, he says no, yes, no, yes, no. Then Gordon writes, we waited for 2 hours at the airport, only to discover that his name was on the list of BWIA passengers. Friendships, I have always believed, might well be the most important relationship in our lives. They're almost the only ones we get to choose. I have given myself the latitude to be grim and morose because I am grim and morose, but also because when you read this book, I do not want you to gloss over the pain. That is what we do every day, and no good comes of it. Thank you.
All right, it's now good afternoon, and and when you speak last, well, there are advantages and disadvantages. So I greet you all, and I'd like to thank Bocas for this excellent annual Lit Fest, which now attracts Caribbean authors and scholars from distant corners of the world. And I am grateful to have been invited to participate in the launch of a literary friendship. We live in a region which is not known for honoring its heroes, so it's all the more heartening that we gather on this bright and beautiful Sunday morning to pay tribute to Gordon and his latest work. It's a way of keeping him alive, and that is a very worthwhile endeavor. As long as he remains alive in our hearts, his thought is explored in our classrooms, his practical recommendations are rehearsed in our public fora, we'll be enriched by the gift that he is, and I don't say was, I say is, to our region and further afield. I too, for my bit of personal recollection, remain immensely grateful to him for a mentorship journey beyond compare, generously given over decades. I first met Gordon in 1975, so there you go. This has gone beyond shaping my academic journey and setting the parameters of my own interaction with graduate students. His sayings still ring in my ears. His pithy wisdom still guides me through tough situations. And in seasons of challenge, his laughter in the face of the day's adversity booms through my inner being. And for this, I give thanks. I want to say some things that have been said before, but perhaps in a little different way. In a literary friendship, we are ushered into the presence of an archivist of a most tumultuous social history. And I quote from the book, "This book is my effort to shape into a coherent narrative over 5 decades of conversation between Kamau Brathwaite and Gordon Rohlehr. This conversation took the form of letters, phone calls, emails, and tapes of conferences where both protagonists were involved. Data concerning long-forgotten encounters have been exhumed from Gordon's notebooks. Clearly on display is the collector of ephemera and minutiae, a preserver of cultural elements in print and in audiovisual forms, and most significantly, a preserver of cultural elements in relationships. Here is the scholar who responds to the fragmentation and disorder by gathering up what Martin Carter terms our scattered skeletons, by exhuming what Erna Broadby identified as submerged and repressed knowledge, by assembling what Walcott terms fragments of identity and cultural artifacts. He thereafter closely examines their shapes and sounds and resonances before fitting it into a vast and complex multidimensional puzzle which refuses to keep still. Witness an archivist with a difference though. Traditionally, the archival task requires care and precision in terms of treatment of precious and delicate material. It requires gloved hands. Gordon best handles his material with the gloves off, and it goes way beyond gloves. He handles his material in a most visceral manner. In other words, he allows the fragments and fragmentation, the submerged and the repressed, to flow through his innermost being. And thus he exudes not only an understanding of how Caribbean people live, suffer, overcome, transcend, and celebrate. He himself becomes a heuristic device, a walking, breathing device on how to live, suffer, overcome, transcend, and celebrate. And many of the testimonies which I had opportunity to gather to produce an essay demonstrates the extent to which people saw him as a walking, breathing lesson and coming near to him was transformative, not simply because of what he knew and how he knew, but how that was filtered through his innermost being and how it therefore qualified him and authorized him. I say it goes beyond qualification. It's an authorization to touch people in a particular way, to touch people and to begin to shape and craft their innermost being. His testimony in relation to this book speaks reams. He says, I quote from the introduction, I had thought of calling this mega narrative the Fragments Whole, and that whole is spelled W/HOLE, or All Them Traveling Years, a chronicle. The fragments and bits and pieces which would seem to so many to be near flotsam and jetsam, under Rohlehr's trained eyes, become reflective of both the depth of the vacancy and the void, the holes, the fissures, the ellipses, the drifting in the hope of reconstruction, but it also becomes the possibilities of what can emerge out of our deep blue seas, oceans themselves, repositories of our pain and loss. The other possible title, All Them Traveling Years, speak of journeys, long, arduous paths that we each must walk as individuals, ethnicities, and nations, seeking to learn themselves. I quote again, Kamau thought that we, he and I, were both trending towards illumination of the everything of our heritage. And he tried to maintain a steady dialogue through which we would exchange experiences and visions. He thought that 1970 was, and he's quoting Kamau now, as important as Morant Bay, close quotation, even though he confessed that he had never been to and did not know Trinidad at all. I was his gateway into a Trinidad that I myself was in a process of discovering, touching another matter, and that is how, because of the nature of his relationships and because of his authorization to convey in a particular way, he himself became for so many a portal. He opened worlds. He opened worlds for me. And many others testify of his capacity to open up worlds. So this is the theme of the first series of lectures in which Rohlehr and Brathwaite engaged with the issue of defining the identity of Caribbean peoples, laying hold of a vision and a narrative that is sufficiently robust to empower us to shape viable futures. Moreover, the archival task in Rohlehr's economy is meaningless unless the knowledge of the people is conveyed in the language of the people back to the people. The man in the street must see himself and must be in a position to dialogue with the emerging picture. This impulse towards laying out the big picture as a narrative and as a mirror in which Caribbean people could see himself is the shared call with which Brathwaite and Rohlehr grapple. Final quotation. While Kamau, Rohlehr is speaking in the text, pushed me towards a big text that would organize and put into perspective everything, politics, kaiso, the young poetry of the revo. And he himself was trying to do the same thing and exploding because of the narrowness of both our space and time in the prison of academia. And he expands, the fixed and still colonial syllabi, teaching norms, the enormous stone of essay reading and examinations imposed on both of us, two Sisyphuses or Sisyphi, grinding towards our respective slopes. In closing, I'll just read a brief passage which demonstrates the process outlines and also reflects the fact that this was not just a pretty picture, a wonderful account, a shared journey it was, but it was like a lot of close relationships. There were conflicts, perhaps misunderstandings, and perhaps hurts. But it reflects something of the depth and the texture of the relationship shared by the two men. After the launch, this passage takes place after Brathwaite's wife dies, and does something that we've seen many of our writers do. Not just writers, many peoples do. They come to a point of death, whether it is death as a result of personal loss, or whether it is death of a dream or an ideal. And because there was so much hope packed and so into the potential and into the possibility, then they begin to speak of the end of all things, because they themselves, it becomes a challenge to envision a future beyond the devastation of that death. So this quote comes at that point in Brathwaite's life. After the launch, this is in relation to his books launched at Mona, Brathwaite returned to his home in Irishtown and penned on November 22nd, 1986, a letter addressed to the Mona community that was simultaneously a personal howl and scream and magnification of the poet, that is, himself, as an individual whose life must be read as a metaphor of the catastrophe and anomie in which the wider society terrifyingly abides. Brathwaite's letter began with an indictment of his colleagues for their having afflicted on him, quote, quote, brutal and frightening neglect. He seems to blame them for, open quotation again, the violent and emotional internal hemorrhage which has been going on and is now black, clotted, and massive, close quotation. Here, in his letter of indictment, which is Rohlehr's title, Edward Kamau Brathwaite was claiming a closeness and almost a sameness and total self-identification with such brutally sacrificed and murdered scapegoats as Mikey Smith, Walter Rodney, and even Christ. Could one trust such self-identification with archetypal victims, or should one see it as another kind of exploitation, a sort of spirit theft, in which the slain hero victim is reduced to the narrating voice of a narcissistic poet? Ultimately, was the reader being asked to forget Rodney Smith or Christ and contemplate instead Kamau in his dungeon of raw suffering, suffering he would later half acknowledge to have brought on himself? Beneath this letter of indictment and the Zia Mexican diary that soon followed lay a confession of guilt on a Laminesque ceremony of souls that varied from the original Haitian ritual in that there was no community, no hooligan, no dancers, no drums, only the individual poetic voice beating its drum and dancing itself and wailing in its own self-created home form. The bereaved man becomes a sort of threat, a specter of what will happen to everybody else. Not quite a scapegoat, but an untouchable from whom one needs to establish spiritual distance, lest one somehow invokes onto oneself the same faith before its due time. So, leave him alone. So, this is what a literary friendship offers: reams of instruction on how to negotiate diverse ways of knowing, and the gut feel of individual and societal negotiation of woundedness and fragmentation, of overcoming and tensile strength. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paula and Anu and Aaron. And now we want to see if we can get some discussion going and still leave a little room for the audience to come in, because we are running out of time. And just to start off where you were leaving off, Paula, I was fascinated. By the way, Aaron, this is not my manuscript. This is Gordon's. Just in case you said anything, I had to look up. And I belong to the paper generation, so I don't have it on my phone. Right. So, Paula, I was fascinated, just to pick up from where you were leaving off, by the graciousness and the elegance of Gordon's treatment of Kamau's sensitivity to criticism and to what Kamau understood as academic spite. There's a clear-eyed, I thought, but deeply empathetic analysis of the loss of Doris and what it meant to Kamau, but also of how Kamau felt about his treatment. And there's a point where, and I have brought this to us to have the note, where Gordon admits that Michael Dash, is candidly correct, but I think cruelly, in describing Brathwaite as more interested in reenacting tragedy than transcending it. And to be dealing, for somebody like Gordon, who is caring and concerned about people's feelings, to be dealing with and having to represent Kamau's bitterness about what has happened. I wondered if you would share some thoughts on his manner of presenting. Just a quick, yes.
Yes. Quickly, Gordon was always compassionate. He brimmed over with compassion, and he always understood. And he was never invested in, and this is from 1975 until, he was never invested, even though he would see with great penetration the root of pain. He was never invested in pulling someone down as a result of the pain. And one of the things that's very interesting to me in the book is how he negotiates that, because you see in the passage, he's brutally honest that this is a kind of, he may have brought it on himself, that he isolated himself, he cut himself off, he perhaps, Brathwaite that is, saw himself as being maybe above the mass of the people, and yet would flagellate and blame them for his isolation. It is his compassion. It's how Gordon's compassion interfaces with his honesty. So he's deeply compassionate and yet extremely, almost brutally honest when he looks at it, and somehow they marry very well.
Yes, and I think there's a lot of there are many ways in which we see that he shares the pain.
Yes.
No, the thing is, more than once Gordon quotes Kamau as saying, "My island is a pebble. I too, it will slay giants but never bear children." But then Gordon says, "I too sing the songs of the skeleton." And I was wondering, Anu, if you could just help us disentangle the pessimisms of Kamau and Gordon. What was...
You're asking me.
I'm asking you.
To Rohlehr. To Rohlehr, the Rohlehr.
Yeah.
I think, in spite of this admission of pessimism, there was, insanely, to some extent, rather a great deal of hope in him that he might have been reluctant to admit to, because boulder after boulder, in this Sisyphistic way, he's pushing, whether he's pushing Kamau's work, he's pushing the work of being an examiner, the work of all the other people that he's writing. The fact that he's writing from here and that he's researching from here, and the thing I mentioned earlier, that decision to work from the Caribbean, to work from Trinidad in particular, and knowing what those limits are. And we're at Bocas, we're in a place where we're being very honest about what the limits are, about publishing, about publicity, about having agents, about all the things that come with being in this industry that we've chosen to be in. Gordon knows all of those things. And Kamau talks about the pebbles, but Kamau is in a place where he can roll, he can sort of polish those pebbles and turn them into sort of gemstones, and make a fine necklace out of them. Gordon is in a place where if he rolls them, he's just going to have a rock that's going to roll back on him.
Yeah.
Did I perhaps go a little further back than you'd hoped I would.
No. We got to talk about this. And I'm thinking that there's so many similarities between them and yet so many differences. And one of the differences, it seemed to me, was that, look, just the sheer amount of movement. Gordon covered ground in his research and his consultations. He was always up and down, but he seemed settled in terms of a sense of home, but yet there was an understanding, and he was concerned, I think, about Kamau's readiness to uproot himself, not just after his wife's death, but he seemed to be always uprooting. He was always improvising. This thing about his manuscripts at the very last minute when they're with the publisher, he's rewriting them and so on and so forth. And yet, so this constant revision of his work and overcrammed agenda seemed to have been a concern of Gordon, who also had a crammed agenda.
Yeah.
And yet, Aaron, can you?
No. Sorry,
Yes.
I don't know if you finished the question. Yes.
I don't know if I've actually made it into a question yet. What I really want to know, is how did you, knowing the motivation of this work and the movement towards publishing and pulling it together, what sort of balance do you see between these two, constantly uprooting and yet constantly drawing together?
Just to say very briefly, because I'm seeing the sign there, and I think we've all, as panelists, spoken very formidably, but far too long. I don't know, even though Kamau, as we would say in the Caribbean, was not easy for publishers, he's not the only one. Those who may know something about publishing with Sylvia Wynter or publishing some of Sylvia Wynter's essays, I'm glancing in the direction of Carol Boyce Davies, would know that there are authors and there are critics who are very challenging to work with on those kinds of questions. So I would just leave that there because I really want us to go to the audience.
Okay. So I want to hear from everybody, and I want to just throw out one question to anybody here, anyone there. There is a great deal of anxiety on both sides about how well they will be remembered, and what permanent impression their work will leave. But aren't these two men immortal? I mean, they are, Brathwaite and Rohlehr. Somehow it seemed to me obvious, but it does not seem somehow in the work to be obvious to them. There is that anxiety. There was a lot of anxiety towards the end, I think, about whether anybody was ever going to continue reading them. I throw it out, but
Yes.
I think that you have to read that book as reflecting different kinds of points of view, different points of arrival for Gordon. So that, like anybody, there is that passage that I think Anu quoted from, where he's sitting down one perhaps long dark night and thinking, does anybody read me anymore? But then there are other times where he's full of confidence about the fact that that he's doing work which is valuable and that people will catch up with it. So I think, like anybody, that that there are points where you wonder whether anybody's listening or not. But then I think that most of the time that kind of ebullience that everybody recognises in Gordon carries him through to keeping going. But yes. Gordon has to be allowed those moments, doesn't he?
Yes.
Where he's on his own, where it's dark, where he wonders, does anybody care?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have questions. We have room for a couple more.
Hi, good morning to everyone. I do have a question. Kamau Brathwaite's work has been one that has roared in the pentameter. That we know this. It's all about how language is used, and he has been very powerful where that is concerned. Professor Rohlehr's language is as equally powerful and as insistent. But I would like the panel to speak to where do you think one fulfills the gaps that the other one has left behind, and how does that speak to how language is now used again for writers moving forward?
Who would like to take that one? Everybody's pointing at everybody else. Speak.
It's a very good question. That's why no one wants to take it.
Yes, you've got it, Aaron. Run with it. Oh, yeah. Well, I always found that that Brathwaite's interest in language as one of the crucial, what has happened to language in the Caribbean is one of the crucial aspects of creolization and so forth. At the same time, he did use his analysis, his references to language in a sort of vague and rather metaphoric way. When he spoke of nation language, it seemed to be one thing one time and another thing another time. And so there was it was not always clear where it was going, and it was changing. It was continuous improvisation of each phrase, while with Gordon, everything was crystal clear. And his discussions of language, he was not a linguist, but his discussions of language were crystal clear and dead on, and you knew exactly where you were. That was my sense of it. But I want to hear questions.
Yeah. I think that Brathwaite was more of a Nancy type figure, and that he was very much involved with, he was very much involved with play. And I think that at many points he played, and that is why I'm not saying that he was inconsistent, but the clarity was not there. I think Gordon was fundamentally a teacher and a visionary. I'm not saying he was only a teacher, get me right. But because I think first and foremost, he was a visionary. But also his agenda was to make clear. So I think the two men were doing different things.
Right. Okay. Do we have space for 2 more questions? Let's have or comment.
Thank you, panelists. As someone who engaged with the work of both Professor Rohlehr and Brathwaite, the men appeal to me in 2 different ways. I always felt that Brathwaite was very self-consumed. I felt his writing was not really to reach out to readers. I felt he was just working out himself in his writing. Whereas Professor Rohlehr, I realized, had a commitment to enlarging the understanding of humanity. And having said this, I also want to speak about the fact that you soon realize that within academic circles and within literary circles, there's always a tendency to not include who you feel you should include. I feel there's a certain type of, how should I call it? A certain type of slight that is always manifested. And maybe Professor Rohlehr would have experienced that. I've seen it. I've seen people talking about Calypso in Trinidad. You're not referring to the man's work. And you're wondering, well, what's within your ideas? There's a work there. You might have read it, but you're not giving him the credit. So I feel that is something that, we need to speak about. Writers and critics are not given credit in certain circles, although when you're reading, you can tell this person has interfaced with the scholarly work of this particular person, So I look forward to reading the book because I feel it will enlarge my own understanding and scope of these 2 men. But what I will say also is that Professor Rohlehr's book, Perfected Fables, I think he was very clear about who he was and what he was signing off on. I don't think any discussion about legacy and so any concern about his legacy was foremost in his mind. And certainly as a reader, that's what I get from his last 2 books, Perfected Fables and Musing Mazes, and so I think he got an opportunity to say all that he wanted to say. He even gave some little statements about St. Augustine in there that I was alarmed. I had to raise my eyebrows.
Yes,
He was thinking, so boy. You know,
I think we're getting out of time. I think we're running out of time. And
well, I wanted to make that comment.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's crucial. Thank you. Last one. Going. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Hello. Just one more. This is the last swift comment or question. Thank you
again
Carol.
for this amazing discussion. I'm wondering, is this kind of a literary masculinity going on? I think there's a big missing elephant in the room somehow. Can you all address that, please?
What's that?
Can you address the question of the sort of literary masculinity? I mean, Derrida had an interesting discussion about male friendship, and it's almost homoerotic sometimes. And I'm just wondering if the panel could address that absence. I think Aaron sort of gestured towards it, but then I didn't hear it.
I don't know. Anybody? Aaron?
Okay, I think that it's fascinating to think about the question of the kind of friendships that men forge, the kind of competition between them. But even the term competition, I don't think is the best word to use in terms of understanding the relationship. I think that Gordon felt aggrieved at points because Kamau, to my understanding, except for the original Love Axel essay, which was published in BIM in the mid-1970s, in which he speaks to Gordon's work, I don't know that Kamau spoke to Gordon's work in print anywhere else. I may be wrong, Jeremy will correct me. And I think that Gordon was genuinely hurt about that. And that had to do with his own concern with his legacy of the extraordinary work that he had done, but the lack of critical engagement with it by scholars in the Caribbean and also beyond the region. But it wasn't that he resented Kamau's success. I think what he resented was the fact that Kamau was so self-absorbed and so trapped in some ways in these deep hurts, whether you think some of them were real, imagined, self-imposed, or not, that he had experienced over the years, particularly the period at Mona in the mid-1980s. Yes. So there's one point, for example, in which Kamau writes Gordon saying despairingly, "Oh, it's my 70th year and no one recognizes it and no one appreciates that this is my 70th year." And Gordon writes him back, "There have been 2 international conferences in your 70th year, okay?" Including the one in New York. For the papers of that, you can look at Timothy Rice's book, For the Geography of the Soul. What are you talking about, Kamau? And I can't remember Kamau's response, usually a relatively resentful silence. So I think that's it. I mean, there's a lot of that going on there, but there's more that we could explore and we could talk about, yes.
And thank you so much, everyone, for sharing with us. This is a fascinating book of a fascinating connection. And thank you.
Please, I think we need a bigger round of applause than that for this panel, for all the speakers. Thank you to all of them. Thank you to Dr. Betty Ann Rohlehr. This is not the first time we've done a Gordon Rohlehr event at the festival where clearly we needed 3 hours and not an hour and a half, right? There's always more to say. So I want to tell you a couple of things. Number one, of course, this is a book launch. The book is available for sale from the booksellers. So please go and buy the book so you can understand what they've been talking about. Our next event here in the fire station starts at 1, so you have time to go off and have the quickest lunch you've ever had. Come back here at 1. There is another event also at 1 o'clock in the library AV room. We hope you're going to stick around for the rest of the afternoon and have a great day. Thank you for coming, everyone.